Okay, thanks, Gary. Firstly, I've actually left my phone, which also is my watch and my kind of life on the train, so I don't know how long this is going to go on. So anyway, thanks. Gary, thanks very much. It's a huge privilege to be here. 8 years ago, I started a company called Carbon Sense because I felt that the way climate change was being communicated didn't really seem to be working. And you know, I'd had one of those midlife crises that one has, and I thought, hey, there must be a better way to do this. And kind of for 3 or 4 years, 5 years, we had a lot of fun getting into some big companies like BT and TNT and others, helping them quite strategically around how they got this message, what it was about, and how they might be able to show some leadership, really. So I've really been fascinated in this question, you know, why don't most people take climate change seriously? I just want to Bob Watson, I was just thinking of him when I heard the psalm at the beautiful evensong just now. Psalm 86, verse 14, is it? O God, the proud are risen against me, and the congregations of naughty men have sought after my soul from the nethermost hell. I thought that was kind of interesting. But then it says, but thou, O Lord God, art full of compassion and mercy, long-suffering and plenteous of truth. So maybe it's the truth and so on that we need to be finding. So I think this story of climate change is the most important story in the world, but people aren't listening, they're not wanting to hear it, or they think it's make-believe. So what I want to do over this next 20 minutes is suggest a different way of framing the story with some help from pictures, because I think pictures really help stories come alive. The story, I think, should be reframed to say that we are changing the atmosphere of the planet. That is the story. And we're changing it at a speed, an order of magnitude faster than anything we've seen in nature. And the challenge is that we're all participants in the change. The kind of core reason why people aren't getting this, I would suggest, is that the gases themselves are invisible. About 4 or 5 years ago, I came across this image from a scientist called Adam Neiman, and I thought it was rather wonderful. This is what the atmosphere would look like if you rolled it into a ball at sea level temperature, 15 degrees centigrade. That is the atmosphere of the planet from a size point of view. And we used this on a report that Carbon Sense did for BT called What Would a Carbon Neutral BT Look Like? Anyway. And I thought this was an interesting image, and when the kind of work that we were doing for the corporate world slightly collapsed about 3 years ago, I got in touch with Adam Neiman, and to cut a very long story short, we set up with him and his colleagues a joint venture business called Carbon Visuals. And the idea is essentially creating a business which uses these techniques to have a different way of telling carbon stories and showing carbon data. Adam has come up with a term he calls concrete visualization, as opposed to abstract visualization. Most data, we view it abstractly, and his definition of this is an approach to data visualization that provides quantitative insight physically rather than purely numerically or geometrically. And another way is to say that it's visualization that's not abstract and that co-opts the world itself into its own explanation. So the idea of carbon visuals is kind of simple. We turn any carbon footprint or data into visual images or film or web tools or whatever by really turning kilos, mass into volume. So this is an example of normal abstract visualization. This is a conventional way of showing some data. Okay, this is for one of the London museums, and it's showing some data in some work we were doing a couple of years ago, how you would normally present this in a normal format. And this is a way of showing exactly the same data as a concrete visualization. That is the same, but it's just switched into showing a volume of CO2. That is the actual volume of CO2 per visitor to those museums over that number of years. Here's another example. So this is an example of emissions per passenger kilometre, part of a project we've just done recently for BP, and showing it as a conventional way, and then that's showing the same data using concrete visualization. So, you know, we think that by doing it this way, you get more of a kind of a feel for and a feel that there is a reality to numbers rather than something that's just theoretical. Okay, that's a picture of all the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in 1850. So that's the pre-industrial CO2. And some people say when they look at that, well, that doesn't look like very much, you know, so kind of what's the problem? Why is that an issue? And if you say to them, well, actually, if that CO2 wasn't in the atmosphere, we would have no plants, and the temperature on the planet would be considerably lower than it is today. So just that small amount of CO2 makes that difference. And then that is the bit that we've put in the last 150 years, most of it, in fact, over the last 50 years, in my lifetime. Another way to look at this data is to actually think of it as, another way to look at the global picture is to think of the daily emissions, which are in fact 80 million tonnes a day. We put 80 million tonnes of CO2 into the atmosphere every day. If that was a layer at 100% concentration over our heads, I suddenly had this thought when I was on holiday a couple of years ago, I wonder what thickness that would be. And as you do, I sent a text to, when you have your mobile phone, to Adam, and he sent me back a text saying 80 microns. 80 microns is the thickness of a piece of paper. Every day we wrap the planet in a paper-thick layer of CO2. Okay, half that's absorbed in oceans and forests and soils, and the other half stays in the atmosphere. And if we've come to call this idea of looking at the atmosphere the carbon quilt, because this is like a layer upon layer upon layer building up. The thickness of the carbon quilt pre-industrialization is somewhere around just over 2 meters. Is that the, yeah. So a 280 parts per million, it's just over 2 meters, okay. And we're now over 3 meters. And obviously heading up in that direction. So we've kind of added a meter thickness to the layer of this carbon quilt. We call it the carbon quilt also because a quilt is composed of patches. This is the carbon footprint of the UK. That is the UK's patch. That's what it looks like with this kind of language. This is the footprint of the USA. So you can, the nice thing about this carbon quilt is that you can scale it at this kind of scale, and you can scale it right down to this kind of scale, and you can say, okay, this journey, putting on this kettle or heating this house or whatever it is, you know, this is the area of the footprint as a patch of the carbon quilt. So we believe this could be a hugely powerful engagement tool. When we kind of launched this a couple of years ago, we thought this would be a huge thing. It was just before Copenhagen, but we weren't able to get any funding to take it past a kind of prototype stage. So we have a kind of prototype web tool out there which is able to generate this kind of image. That is the carbon footprint as a red patch there of the emission savings from the hydroelectric turbines that have been put into the Thames just up the road, okay? Which I just thought it would be nice to show something from around here. But I thought what was the thing that actually interested me in the article in the Telegraph, it said the Queen herself was unable to install the turbines as it's on the stretch of the Thames owned by the environmentalists. So I thought that was quite good. So how do we kind of make this personal? Well, you know, the thing about making concrete visualizations is that you can take any data, and as long as you put it in a place that is familiar in the landscape or from near familiar objects, it starts to make sense, properly make sense. So here's one that Adam's just done recently, just showing the emissions, different per capita emissions. There's a daily emission. one of the challenges is when you look at annual emissions, they tend to be rather huge sometimes, and it's difficult to get a suitable reference point. Here's London's daily carbon dioxide emissions, 136,000 tonnes. It's probably about 4 years old, the data. But that is what it would look like if you put the whole of London's emissions into a single sphere and put it next to these iconic buildings. And because we know what these buildings, if we're Londoners particularly, we have a feeling for the size and scale of these. I would suggest again, this kind of makes more sense. We got a call from the BBC One Planet television radio series, World Service Series, who said our footprint is just under 35 tonnes per year for the programme. Kind of what does that look like? So we played around a bit and came up with this way. Those are 10-tonne blocks of CO2, and that is the annual footprint of the One Planet programme. We were looking for a company who was actually developing a merchant ship, a sailing ship, a modern sailing coastal freight ship. So around this kind of size, 3,000 tonnes. And they wanted to have a sort of an image that showed their ship versus conventional vessel. So that is a conventional 3,000-tonne cargo ship, and every day it puts 16 tonnes, and each of those is the tonne, into the atmosphere when it's normally operating. So that is an image of that ship that somehow we can kind of relate to, I would suggest, more than if we just had the number. There we are. What's a tonne of CO2? There we are. That's what it looks like. It's about 8.1, I think, meters. And on our Carbon Quilt website, we've got a calculator that enables you to look at, you can just feed in any amount, kilos, grams, megatons, gigatons, anything, and you'll get a patch of the Carbon Quilt or a cube or a sphere, so that's automatically worked out. So the maths here aren't too difficult, but what is, I think the trick is in making it work visually and finding ways to do that. Here's an example of where you can use this to help start moving beyond just getting a kind of aha, so it's real, but you start getting into helping people make choices. So on the right we have a conventional 60-watt light bulb. UK grid electricity will put that amount of CO2 into the atmosphere, and on the left a compact fluorescent. Of course that image will be different in different countries. So in France that will be a lot less because of the nuclear, and in Australia and the States it'll be higher. So these are ways we can do that. Okay, so here are some, so we tried to launch this with the Carbon Quilt, and actually we found it was difficult getting funding. So we then switched into providing kind of bespoke visuals and for fee-paying clients. So here's just an example of some of the jobs we've done recently. We were approached by the agency who was doing this target neutral project for BP, and as part of the relaunch, this had been an offsetting website where drivers were invited to just go online, kind of put in what their car is and their annual mileage, and then it works out what their carbon footprint is, and they offset that amount. That's what it was. And BP wanted to change that and make it much more around behaviour change and changing driving habits and so on. So they came up with this idea of a dashboard. We helped around the way that could work and be integrated with a way of showing volumes of CO2 for in real time. So as you change different variants on the website, it changes that sphere on the right, and then you can switch to another screen which can compare yours to UK average, different countries, 2050 targets, etc. So it's just a way of people getting more of a feeling around what that carbon footprint is. This is a set of images that we did for the South Kensington estate. So the V&A, all the different museums, the Science Museum, the Natural History Museum, and the Albert Hall and Imperial College, kind of there in the middle. So that whole estate, we have as Carbon Sensitivity working with a project called the Carbon Reduction Master Plan, which was really looking at technologies that could help that whole estate seriously reduce their emissions. I think they got the biggest Treasury funding 4 years ago for something called Invest to Save, just under £3 million. And that helped this project, which part of it was a communications aspect, and we were involved in that. So that's actually showing the different institutions, that's showing the emissions in 2009-10, and we had a number of ways of showing that, which were then incorporated into the final report and so on, and that was used. That's really being used to try and influence policymakers and trustees of these institutions in terms of releasing funding for capital projects, okay, which are going to help with this carbon reduction. So it's kind of, yeah, that's the purpose of that project. This is one we've just done fairly recently for Plymouth University, which is again showing different buildings emissions. We've done a fairly simple model, quite a clean model of the campus with the different buildings, and then we're showing annual emissions and daily emissions. And we're going to be using this to do some research with Plymouth around behaviour change using this imagery versus conventional data imagery versus no imagery with different focus groups. So we're going to start getting some research backing, if you like, to what we're finding anecdotally. Yeah. So this is one of the images on that. Pretty simple. There are ways to do this which are relatively simple. Some of which we're now automating, so we can literally do that for nothing. And other ways, as you start to go into higher quality, you have to go for more higher quality techniques, which cost more money. This would be a film that I would show you, but in the transferring it from my computer to this computer, it's not running. But for anybody who's interested, we could maybe try and get it working maybe tomorrow morning, something, I don't know, we can talk to Gary. This was a short clip from a film we did for ADAS showing the carbon story on 10 farms in the Peak District, and the emissions from those farms, which kind of is a block like that, and then the sequestration annually with all the cubes of CO2 running out. But the really big story is actually the stored carbon there, which completely dwarfs the emissions and the sequestration. So the story that comes out of watching that film is that the farmers in that landscape are guardians of a carbon store, and that really needs to be taken into account. And then this is another one which would look great. We're combining CGI with a real film here, and this is showing the carbon footprint of UK potatoes. And we get it building up on the table in front